Hello, welcome to the YouTube channel for the Critical Thinking Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. I'm Donna Warren, and I'm director of the center. Well, we are on the cusp of a brand new academic year, and it's an exciting time. I think at the center this year, we are going to be focusing a little bit on critical thinking dispositions. Generally speaking, the critical thinking literature distinguishes between critical thinking skills on the one hand and critical thinking dispositions on the other. Essentially, a critical thinking skill is something you do that raises the probability of having justified beliefs or reduces the probability of having unjustified beliefs. For example, under the ability to understand points of view that differ from your own, that's a critical thinking skill. The ability to identify fallacies and avoid them, that's a critical thinking skill too. Critical thinking dispositions are essentially intellectual habits or tendencies to activate or practice those critical thinking skills under the right circumstances and for the right reasons. So, for example, open-mindedness might be defined as the critical thinking disposition that involves understanding points of view that differ from our own in order to learn from those points of view and perhaps modify our own perspectives, as opposed to understanding those points of view in order to better defeat the opposition, right? So we have critical thinking skills and critical thinking dispositions. Critical thinking dispositions bear important similarities to intellectual virtues. And two intellectual virtues that interest me are intellectual humility and intellectual confidence. Essentially, intellectual humility is recognizing that there's lots of stuff that we don't know, and a lot of the things that we think we know are mistaken. Intellectual confidence is recognizing that there are a lot of things we do know, and a lot of the things that we think we know are in fact correct. So intellectual humility and intellectual confidence are complementary virtues, and a good education should develop them both so that we can be well-balanced thinkers. In a fascinating article by Ward Jones called, I want to get the name right, and I will actually put the citation in the show notes, Higher Education, Academic Communities, and the Intellectual Virtues, Jones argues that there are two different kinds of disciplines, and each of these kinds of disciplines develops intellectual confidence and intellectual humility in different ways. On the one hand, there are consensus building disciplines like the natural science. And the distinguishing feature of a consensus building discipline is that the whole purpose is to come to some sort of reasoned agreement in order to generate results which can then be passed on to new generations of scholars, right? This is exactly why physicists don't have to continually rediscover the structure of an atom. That has been done. Now, I understand that things change, and these results become more sophisticated over time. But to some level of approximation, natural science gives us results, which then can be learned by new up-and-coming scientists who can then build on those results. That's consensus building disciplines. Non-consensus building disciplines, like the humanities, including philosophy, which is my own discipline, don't operate like that. The point of philosophy in particular is not to discover once and for all whether human beings have free will, so that then I can tell my students whether or not human beings have free will, and then they can grow up to become philosophers, and then they can develop positions about the existence or non-existence of free will that essentially build upon the established knowledge in the philosophical community. That's not how philosophy works. These issues are kind of continually up for debate. And when I talk to my students about the nature of free will, the point is not for them to learn the truth about free will, but rather to understand the arguments on all sides of the issues, be able to critique those arguments, and then to justify their own position referring to those arguments, right? So it's not for them to agree with me. It's not for them to agree with each other. That's not what we're about. We are not consensus building. So on the one hand, consensus building disciplines like the natural sciences. On the other hand, non-consensus building disciplines like the humanities. So how does this bear upon the intellectual virtues or the critical thinking dispositions of intellectual humility and intellectual confidence? Well, Jones says that both kinds of disciplines develop humility and confidence in slightly different ways. Students who are learning consensus building disciplines, like a natural science, have confidence that the positions that they are learning are probably correct or some kind of approximation of correct because they've been sort of vetted by the entire community of scholars. On the other hand, they have intellectual humility because they realize that their knowledge is to some extent inherited or bequeathed to them by previous scholars. Students in the non-consensus building disciplines have confidence in their positions because they own the reasoning themselves. If a philosopher has a position about free will, that position is grounded by that philosopher's own reasoning. And there's a kind of confidence in that. On the other hand, because philosophy is not a consensus building discipline, one philosopher's position will be contested by other philosophers. And so there's a humility in that, in realizing that, maybe I'm wrong and philosophers who disagree with me are correct. By the way, parenthetically, this issue of disagreement I find fascinating. So you can count on a video or two about that sometime in the future. I just can't not talk about the nature of disagreement. So there we have it, right? Intellectual confidence. I know things and the things I know are correct. Intellectual humility, lots of stuff I don't know, and some of the stuff I think I know is not true. Consensus building disciplines, like the sciences, build humility and confidence in different ways. And non-consensus building disciplines, like the humanities, also build intellectual humility and intellectual confidence in different ways. So I think this tells in favor of having people know a little bit about science, know a little bit about humanities, in order to really build the entire suite of critical thinking dispositions and become well-balanced thinkers. I think that also gives us something to think about, even if we are not in school right now, if we just think about to what extent and in what contexts is our knowledge dependent upon what other people know. How much of what you know about things do you know because people told you, which is fine often, and how much of what you know do you know because you figured it out, which is also fine often. And if you know things because someone told it to you and a lot of other people agree with you and that person who told it to you is an expert, that should give you some kind of confidence that you're probably right. It should also give you some kind of humility in that you didn't figure it out yourself. On the other hand, if you know something because you figured it out, well, that should give you some confidence because you figured it out. It should also give you some humility because if people disagree with you, and they certainly will, maybe you're the one who's wrong. So something to think about. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Hope we do too with all the students coming back, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.